Australia was always clear about its side in this war.
We are with Ukraine. I had meetings with President Zelensky on multiple occasions, including, of course, in Kyiv in Ukraine, where I traveled very early on in my prime ministership. And this year we've seen that land war in Europe go on for 3 years. The people of Ukraine are fighting not just for their own national sovereignty, they are fighting for the international rule of law. Australia has committed about $1.5 billion to help Ukraine defend itself. More than $1.3 billion of that is military support. We will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Because this is the struggle of a democratic nation versus an authoritarian regime, led by Vladimir Putin, who clearly has imperialistic designs, not just on Ukraine, but throughout that region.
Since the first day of the invasion, Australia has been at the forefront of supporting Ukraine so far. What is it like, Zanato? It was more than $1.5 billion in aid. And do you want to know what's even more surprising? Most of that aid is military. They sent their famous armored vehicles, Bushmaster.
Originally built for the Australian outback, the Bushmaster protective mobility vehicle now fights in Ukraine against Russia. Speak with the 80th Airborne Brigade, who fought near Bakhmut for over 6 months. They know how to break through the heavily mined areas formerly controlled by Russia.
Obuza's air defense systems, M777. I'm good here, look. Show me. The list is long, but the thousands of military equipment, the billions invested, all the statements of support, all of that might seem small compared to what Australia just did. Because on September 18th of this year, Australia decided to do something completely different. Without firing a single shot, without sending a single tank, they dealt a heavy blow to Russia, a blow that the Russians are desperately trying to reverse. But it might be too late. To understand what happened, you need to know about a secret war that's happening in the oceans right now. An invisible war involving more than 1,000 ghost ships. And when I say ghost ships, I'm not talking about fiction. I'm talking about real ships that disappear from radar. When they want to, they lie about where they are. They change flags like chameleons. These ships carry the most important thing for Putin, Russian oil. Oil. And Russia has spent more than $10 billion to create this secret fleet. $10 billion is enough money to buy 200 modern fighter jets. And do you want to know why Putin made this gigantic investment? The answer will surprise you. In a few words, the West created a perfect trap. And it's not about banning the purchase of Russian oil. It was something much smarter than that. They now control the insurance for ships. 90% of maritime insurance in the world is controlled by Western companies. It's like controlling all the roads. It doesn't matter how many cars you have, without roads, you're not going anywhere. It works more or less like this. If Russia wants to use Western insurance for its ships, it can only sell oil at a maximum price. Until now, it was $60 per barrel, no more than that. If it sells for more, it loses insurance, and uninsured ships are disasters waiting to happen. As you can imagine, Putin hates this rule, but he needs it. Operating without Western insurance is far riskier and costlier. So he did what he always does. He found a way to get around the system. And that's how his famous Ghost Fleet was born. The Ghost Fleet is made up of old ships that were bought in a hurry. And when I say old, I really mean old. Just so you know, most are over 20 years old. For a ship, that's a lot. These are ships that should be retired, but they're still sailing with oil across the oceans. And even worse, 70% of these ships don't have proper insurance. If one of them causes a major accident, there's no one to pay the cleanup bill. And the way they operate is astonishing. They use tricks worthy of a spy movie. The first trick is to disappear from the radar. In other words, they turn off their tracking systems when they get close to Russian ports. They simply vanish from digital maps. The second trick is even smarter. They lie about where they are. The ship may appear in the system to be in Bulgaria, but it's actually loading oil in Russia. And the third trick is the boldest one. They change the flag, switch countries, and change registration all the time. They choose countries that don't ask too many questions. I'm talking about countries like Gabon, Comoros, places that most people don't even know where they are on the map. And the last trick is the most elaborate of all. They do transfers out at sea. It's something like this. Small ships loaded in Russia meet giant ships in the middle of the ocean and transfer the cargo. Russian oil then becomes oil of unknown origin. But Putin didn't expect that Australia would be watching all of this, studying every ship, every route, every movement. And on September 18th, they decided to act. It was a double blow that caught Putin by surprise. First, Australia lowered the price cap on Russian oil from $60 to $47.60 per barrel. It may seem small, but the impact is huge. Just to give you an idea, Russia sells 7,300,000 barrels per day. With this price reduction, they could lose more than $90 million per day. $90 million. Every single day, doing the math for the whole year. That means $33 billion less for Putin. Just so you have an idea of what $33 billion is, that's more money than the military budget of many countries. It's enough to buy 600 modern warplanes. It's a huge fortune disappearing from Russian coffers. But that was just the first blow. The second one was even more precise. Australia sanctioned 95 ships from the Ghost Fleet all at once. 95 ships that have now become much more difficult and risky to use. And the most curious thing about this story is the way these sanctions work. Because they force insurance companies to put rules in place that prohibit ships from turning off their tracking systems. Remember the trick of disappearing from the radar that I mentioned earlier? Well, now it's much more dangerous to do that. But Australia didn't do this alone. The European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and even Japan did the same thing together. It's pretty much the entire developed world joining forces against Putin. The only one left out was the United States, which kept the price cap at $60. Now comes the unexpected part. While Russia is losing billions of dollars, there are people making a lot of money from this. The main beneficiary here isn't Russia's ally, but China. To give you an idea, China saved $16 billion by buying cheap Russian oil. Now stop and think about that for a moment. The war in Ukraine is, in other words, unintentionally subsidizing the Chinese economy. Look, with this cheap energy, Chinese factories are able to produce at lower costs, and as a result, they can sell products all over the world at better prices. Putin is actually financing China's growth at the expense of Russia itself. That's why China is now the world's top buyer of Russian oil. Before, they bought little, but now they buy over 100 million tons yearly, and anyone who thinks it's out of friendship is wrong. No, it's just business. China knows that Russia is desperate to sell and negotiates extremely low prices. India also became a major buyer. Before the war, Russia sold less than 2% of the oil that India bought. Today, it sells 40%. Analysts say India has become a laundromat for Russian oil. They buy cheap Russian oil, refine it in their factories, and sell the finished products back to Europe. And here comes a rather interesting detail. Embarrassing. Look, Australia, leading these sanctions, spent about $2.5 billion on refined Indian products. Yes, that's correct. They were made with Russian oil. It's like they're trying to close the front door while leaving the back door wide open. This contradiction shows the biggest flaw of the sanctions. Stop and think about it. Countries ban the direct purchase of Russian oil, but they don't ban products made with Russian oil in other countries. Countries like India, China, and Turkey have become intermediaries. They buy cheap Russian oil, process it, and sell the finished products to those who imposed the sanctions. Now, anyone who thinks Putin is quietly accepting these losses is mistaken. Russia has already shown that it is willing to create confusion to protect its shadow fleet. Russian warplanes have already escorted shadow ships to prevent inspections by other countries. When Estonia tried to inspect a suspicious ship, Russian fighter jets intervened directly.
Russia has shown this confusion, this shadow fleet. Russia
is willing to protect its shadow fleet in this confusion. Request will be denied. Follow my instructions. Alter your course to 105 immediately. Over.
Now it's right above us, coming straight over us.
aircrafted.
Plane. It's a drone.
The Ghost Fleet also poses major environmental risks. They're old, poorly maintained ships lacking insurance, sailing near Europe. If one of them causes a massive spill, it would be an environmental catastrophe. And cleaning up that mess, besides being expensive, is practically impossible. So the question everyone wants to know is, will Australia really be able to impact Russia with this decision? And look, I need to be honest in saying, not completely, but it has already caused considerable damage. That's because the sanctions achieved three important things. First, they forced Russia to sell its oil always at a discount compared to the world price. Even if oil prices go up worldwide, Russia doesn't earn as much as it could. Second, they forced Putin to spend billions on a fleet of old and dangerous ships. Every dollar spent on these ships is one less dollar for the war. Third, they showed that Western countries can come together to put economic pressure on Russia. But the sanctions also showed their limitations. Russia managed to maintain its oil sales by redirecting them to Asia instead of Europe. It developed new payment systems and created lasting partnerships with China and India. The Russian economy, even under pressure, showed more resilience than many expected. The sanctions also created unintended problems and economically benefited Western rivals like China and India. They created enormous environmental risks with the shadow fleet and split the global oil trade into two separate markets. It's clear that for sanctions to work better in the future, countries need to close the existing loopholes. That means creating stricter rules for refined products, cracking down more aggressively on the facilitators of the shadow fleet, conducting more physical inspections of suspicious ships, and making all countries use the same price cap. But there's no denying that Australia's action shows progress. Instead of just banning direct purchases, they targeted the entire system that allowed Russia to circumvent the rules. They targeted both the product and the ships that transport it. And they did all of this in coordination with their allies to maximize the impact. Meanwhile, Russia is desperately trying to reverse this situation. It is buying more old ships, developing new payment systems, and deepening partnerships with countries that do not follow the sanctions. But each of these measures costs billions and takes away the money they need to fund their war machine. The question isn't whether Australia is managing to break Russia. The question is, how long will it take? Putin is able to maintain two wars at the same time, a military one in Ukraine and an economic one in the oceans. Resources aren't infinite, and the choices, well, they're getting harder. And with every new sanction, every new ship blocked, every new coordinated measure, that question becomes even more pressing for Putin. And he knows he needs an answer. The answer could define not only the future of the war in Ukraine, but the future of Russia itself as a world power. And it all started with Australia deciding it was time to strike where it really hurts, in Putin's pocket. Now, your thoughts. Do you believe that these measures taken by Australia and other Western allies will really have a big impact on Russia? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this video opened your eyes to a war you didn't even know existed, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to understand how the world really works behind the scenes. See you in the next video.